All right, hello, Internet. I'm going to be picking up on page 140. This section is form. Just give me a minute. All right. 140, so we're going to get to 155. No page break. All right. Incontestably, the quintessence of all elements of logicality, or more broadly, coherence in artworks, is form. It is astonishing, however, how little aesthetics reflected on the category of form, how much it, the distinguishing aspect of art, has been assumed to be unproblematically given. The difficulty in getting a grasp on it is in part due to the entwinement of all aesthetic form with content. Form is not only to be conceived in opposition to content, but through it, if aesthetics is not to fall prey to an abstractness that habitually makes it the ally of reactionary art. Indeed, the concept of form has been the blind spot of aesthetics right up to Valéry, because everything about art is so inextricably tied up with it that the concept defies isolation. As little as art is to be defined by any other element, it is simply identical with form. Every other element can be negated in the concept of form, even aesthetic unity, the idea of form that first made the wholeness and autonomy of the artwork possible. In highly developed modern works, form tends to dissociate unity, either in the interest of expression or to criticize art's affirmative character. Long before the ubiquitous crisis, open forms existed. In Mozart, the unity of the work was occasionally playfully tested by its relaxation. By juxtaposing relatively disjointed or contrasting elements, Mozart, the composer who is praised above all others for the rigor of his form, masterfully juggles the concept of form itself. He is so sure of its strength that he effectively let go the reins and, on the basis of the security of the construction itself, gives the lead to centrifugal forces. For Mozart, the heir of an older tradition, the idea of unity as form is still so unshaken that it is able to bear the utmost pressure, whereas for Beethoven, in whom unity lost its substantiality under the nominalist assault, there is a need to assert unity far more strictly. Unity preforms the multicipitous contents a priori and thus tames them all the more triumphantly. Today, artists would like to do away with unity altogether, though with the irony that those works that are supposedly open and incomplete necessarily regain something comparable to unity insofar as this openness is planned. For the most part, theory equates form with symmetry or repetition. There is no reason to deny that, if one wanted to reduce the concept of form to invariance, equality and repetition could be lined up in opposition to inequality, that is, to contrast and development. But little would be gained by setting up such categories. Musical analyses, for example, show that even in those works most diffuse and hostile to repetition, similarities are involved, that many parts correspond with others in terms of shared distinguishing characteristics, and that it is only through the relation to these elements of identity that the sought-after non-identity is achieved. Without sameness of any sort, chaos itself would prevail as something ever same. Indeed, the distinction between repetition that is superficial, heteronomously decreed, and incompletely mediated by specific details, and, on the other hand, the ineluctable determination of the unlike by a degree of sameness, is a distinction that decisively outweighs all invariance. If this distinction is ignored by a concept of form sympathetic with invariance, the result is an affinity for the bestial phraseology that indulges in expressions like consummate form. Because form is the central concept of aesthetics and is always presupposed by it in the givenness of art, aesthetics must gather all its forces to think the concept through. If aesthetics is not to be trapped in tautologies, it must gain access to what is not simply immanent in the concept of form. Yet the concept of form refuses to grant a voice to anything aesthetic that claims independence from it. An aesthetics of form is possible only if it breaks through aesthetics as the aesthetics of the totality of what stands under the spell of form. Whether art is in any way still possible depends precisely on this. The concept of form marks out art's sharp antithesis to an empirical world in which art's right to exist is uncertain. Art has precisely the same chance of survival as does form, no better. The participation of form in the crisis of art becomes evident in statements like those of Lukács, who said that in modern art the importance of form has been greatly overestimated. Evident in this Philistine call to arms is a discontent with art of which Lukács, this cultural conservative, is unconscious, as well as a concept of form that is inadequate to art. To hit upon the idea that form has been overestimated in art, one must fail to recognize that form is essential to art, that it mediates content. Form is the artifact's coherence, however self-antagonistic and refracted, through which each and every successful work separates itself from the merely existing. Lukács's unreflected concept of form, with its hue and cry over formalism, sets form in opposition to the content of poems, compositions, and paintings as an organization that can simply be lifted off the work. Form is thereby conceived as something superimposed, subjectively dictated, whereas it is substantial only when it does no violence to what is formed and emerges from it. Indeed, what is formed, the content, does not amount to objects external to form. Rather, the content is mimetic impulses that are drawn into the world of images that is form. The innumerable and pernicious equivocations of the concept of form can be traced to its ubiquity, which produces the temptation to call everything and anything that is artistic in art form. In any case, the concept of form is fruitless if nothing more is meant than the trivial generality that the artwork's material, whether this means intentional objects or materials such as tones or colors, mediates instead of simply being present. It is just as inapt to define form as it is to define what is conferred by the subject and bears the stamp of that subject. What can rightly be called form in artworks fulfills the desiderata of that on which subjective activity takes place just as much as it is the product of subjective activity. In artworks, form is aesthetic essentially insofar as it is an objective determination. Its locus is precisely there where the work frees itself from being simply a product of subjectivity. Form is thus not to be sought in the arrangement of pre-given elements, as the theory of pictorial composition held it to the prior being debunked by Impressionism. That nevertheless so many artworks, including precisely those that are applauded as classical, prove under careful scrutiny to be just such an arrangement is a fatal objection to traditional art. There's absolutely no reducing the concept of form to mathematical relations, as is envisioned by aesthetics of Zeissing's era. Such relations, whether explicitly invoked as principles during the Renaissance, are latently coupled with mystical ideas, as perhaps occasionally in Bach, plays a role as technical procedures, yet they are not form itself, but rather its vehicle, the means by which the newly liberated subject, dependent strictly on its own resources, preforms otherwise chaotic and undifferentiated material. Just how little mathematical organization and everything related to it coincides with aesthetic form is audible in the recent history of 12-tone technique, which in fact preforms the material of the establishment of numerical relations of permutated rows in which no tone may occur before the other tone has preceded it, which in fact preforms the material by the establishment of numerical relations of permutated rows. Immediately it became evident that this preformation did not constitute form in the fashion expected by Erwin Stein's program, which not by accident carried the title New Principles of Form. Schoenberg himself distinguished almost mechanically between the preparation of 12-tone material and composition, and on account of this distinction he had reason to regret his ingenious technique. The heightened logical consistency of the following generation, however, which obliterated the distinction between the preparation of the material and actual composition, not only exchanged integration for music's self-alienation, but incurred the loss of articulation, without which form is almost inconceivable. It is as if the immanent nexus of the work, when abandoned completely to itself without any interference, without the effort to bear the totality of form out of the heterogeneous, relapses into the raw and crude. In fact, the totally organized works of the serial phase have almost completely surrendered the means of differentiation in which they originated. Mathematization as a method for the immanent objectivation of form is chimerical. Its insufficiency can perhaps be clarified by the fact that artists resort to it during historical periods when the traditional self-evidence of forms dissolves and no objective canon is available. At these moments, the artist has recourse to mathematics. It unifies the level of subjective reason attained by the artist with the semblance of an objectivity founded on categories such as universality and necessity. This is semblance because the organization, the relation of elements to each other that constitutes form, does not originate in the specific structure and fails when confronted with the particular. For this reason, mathematization favors precisely those traditional forms that it at the same time denounces as irrational. Rather than embodying the abiding lawfulness of being, its own claim to legitimacy, the mathematical aspect of art despairingly strives to guarantee its possibility in a historical situation in which the objectivity of the conception of form is as requisite as it is inhibited by the level of consciousness. Frequently, the concept of form proves limited in that, depending on the circumstances, it locates form in one dimension regardless of others, as, for example, when musical form is located in temporal succession, as if simultaneity and polyphony do not contribute to form, or when in painting form is attributed to proportions of space and surface at the cost of the form-giving function of color. In contrast to this, Aesthetic form is the objective organization within each artwork of what appears as bindingly eloquent. It is the non-violent synthesis of the diffuse that nevertheless preserves it as what it is in its divergences and contradictions, and for this reason form is actually an unfolding of truth. A posited unity, it constantly suspends itself as such. Essential to it is that it interrupts itself through its other, just as the essence of its coherence is that it does not cohere. Its relations to the other, whose foreignness it mollifies and yet maintains. Form is what is anti-barbaric in art. Through form, art participates in the civilization that it criticizes by its very existence. Form is the law of the transfiguration of the existing, counter to which it represents freedom. Form secularizes the theological model of the world as an image made in God's likeness, though not as an act of creation, but as the objectivation of the human comportment that imitates creation, not creatio ex nihilo, but creation out of the created. The metaphorical expression is irresistible, that form in artworks is everything on which the hand has left its trace, everything over which it has passed. Form is the seal of social labor, fundamentally different from the empirical process of making. What artists directly perceive as form is best elucidated e contrario as an antipathy to the unfiltered in the artwork, to the grouping of color that is simply factual without being articulated or animated in itself, an antipathy to the rote musical sequence, the topos, the pre-critical. Form converges with critique. It is through which artworks prove self-critical. What in the work rebels against any untransformed residue is really the bearer of form, and art is disavowed wherever support is given to the theodicy of the unformed, whether under the name of musicality or ham acting. By its critical implication, form annihilates practices and works of the past. Form repudiates the view that artworks are immediately given. If form is that in artworks by which they become artworks, it is equivalent with their mediatedness, their objective reflectedness into themselves. Form is mediation in that it is the relation of parts to each other and to the whole, and as the elaboration of details. With regard to form, then, the much-praised naivete of artworks turns out to be hostile to art. What may appear intuitive and naive in artworks, their constitution as something that presents itself as self-coherent, gapless, and therefore unmediated, derives from their mediatedness in themselves. It is only through this mediatedness that they become significative and their elements become signs. Everything in artworks that resembles language originates in form and is thus transformed into the antithesis of form, the mimetic impulse. Form seeks to bring the particular to speech through the whole. However, this is the melancholy of form, especially among artists in whose work form prevails. Form inevitably limits what is formed, for otherwise its concept would lose its specific difference to what is formed. This is confirmed by the artistic labor of forming, which is always a process of selecting, trimming, renouncing. Without rejection there is no form, and this prolongs guilty domination in artworks, of which they would like to be free. Form is their amorality. They do injustice to what they form by following it. At least something of this was sensed by vitalism's endlessly rehearsed assurance, ever since Nietzsche, of the antithesis between form and life. Art becomes entangled in the guilt context of the living, and only because its distance allows the guilt context to prevail, but even more importantly because it makes incisions in the living in order to help it to language and thus mutilates it. The myth of Procrustes recounts the philosophical proto-history of art. Yet the total condemnation of art does not follow from this any more than it does elsewhere from partial guilt in the context of total guilt. Whoever rails against art's putative formalism, against art being art, advocates the very inhumanity with which he charges formalism and does so in the name of cliques that, in order to retain better control of the oppressed, insist on adaptation to them. Whenever the inhumanity of spirit is indicted, it is a judgment passed against humanity. Only that spirit does justice to humanity that, rather than serving it according to what it has become, immerses itself in that which, unknown to humanity, is its own. The campaign against formalism ignores the fact that form that befalls content is itself sedimented content. This, and not regression to any pre-artistic emphasis on content, secures the primacy of the object in art. Aesthetic categories of form such as particularity, development, and resolution of conflict, even in the anticipation of reconciliation through homeostasis, are transparent with regard to their content even, and most of all, where they have separated themselves from the empirical objects. Precisely by distance from it, art adopts its stance toward the empirical world in which conflicts appear immediate and as absolute cleavages. Their mediation, implicitly contained in the empirical, becomes the for itself of consciousness only by the act of stepping back from it, which is what art does. This stepping back is, as such, an act of knowledge. Those features of modern art on which account it has been ostracized as formalistic derive, without exception, from the fact that in them content flickers incarnate, instead of having been preemptorily adjusted by an easily marketable harmony. Emancipated expression, in which all of modern art's forms originated, was a protest against romantic expression by a depositional character that is antagonistic to the forms. This was the force of their substantiality. Kandinsky coined the term cerebral acts. This historico-philosophical significance of the emancipation of form is that it refuses to mollify alienation in the image, exclusively thereby incorporating the alienated, that it defines the alienated as such. The Hermetic works bring more criticism to bear on the existing than do those that, in the interest of intelligible social criticism, devote themselves to conciliatory forms and silently acknowledge the flourishing culture industry. In the dialectic of form and content, the scale also tips toward form, against Hegel, because content, which his aesthetics wanted to smudge, degenerated to a positivistic given, a mold for the reification against which, according to Hegel's theory, art protests. Thus, the more deeply the content is experienced and transformed unrecognizably into formal categories, the less the unsublimated materials are commensurable with the content of artworks. Everything appearing in the artwork is virtually content, as much as it is form, whereas form remains that by which the appearing determines itself, and content remains what is self-determining. To the extent that aesthetics achieved an energetic concept of form, it legitimately opposed the pre-artistic view of art by seeking what is specifically aesthetic exclusively in form, by seeking out form's transformations as such in the comportment of the aesthetic subject. This was axiomatic for the conception of art history as cultural history. But what promises to emancipate and thus strengthen the subject weakens it at the same time through its isolation. Hegel is right that all aesthetic processes are bound up with content, just as in the history of the plastic arts and literature, new levels of the external world constantly become apparent and are discovered and assimilated, whereas others perish, lose their artistic potential, and no longer excite even the worst commercial painter to grant them a brief eternity on canvas. In this regard, it is worth mentioning the studies of the Warburg Institute, many of which penetrated to the center of artistic content through the analysis of motifs. In poetics, Benjamin's study of the German Baroque shows an analogous tendency, motivated by the rejection of the confusion of subjective intentions with aesthetic content, and ultimately of the alliance of aesthetics and idealist philosophy. The elements bound up with content undergird the substance in opposition to the pressure of subjective intention. The articulation by which the artwork achieves its form also always coincides in a certain sense with the defeat of form. The gapless and unforced unity of form and the formed succeeded, as is intended by the idea of form. This would amount to the achievement of the identity of the identical and non-identical. But it is vis-a-vis the fact that this has not been achieved that the artwork is motivated to wall itself up in the imaginary confines of an identity that is merely for itself. The arrangement of a whole in accordance with the sum of its complexes, which is the idea of articulation, is never completely adequate, whether as the division of a lava mass into a multitude of small garden plots, or whether it is because of an external residue remaining after the divergent has been unified. A prototypical instance of this is the sweet-like, unmastered randomness of the succession of movements in an integrated symphony. What may be called a work's level of form, a term employed in graphology ever since Ludwig Klages, depends on its degree of articulation. This concept called a halt to the relativism of Riegel's artistic will. There are types of art, as well as phases in its history, in which articulation was of little concern or was impeded by conventional procedures. Articulation's adequacy to artistic will, and the objective historical sense of form that it bears, does not make it any less inferior. Under the constraint of an encompassing "it shall not be," such works fail to carry out what they are obliged to fulfill according to their own logicality. Like desk-bound white-collar workers whose ancestors were artists of an inferior level of form, their unconscious whispers in their ears that the utmost is not possible for the little men that they are. Yet the utmost is nevertheless the law of form of what they undertook to do. It is rarely noted, even in art criticism, that neither individual nor collective art wills its own concept, which develops from within. Rather, like people who laugh even when there is nothing funny. Many artworks are undertaken with tacit resignation. For their diminished claim, they are rewarded by making art historians and the public happy. It would be worthwhile to analyze to what degree such aesthetic resignation has since antiquity contributed to the division of high and low art, a division whose decisive reason is obviously that culture proved unsuccessful for precisely those who produced it. In any case, even so apparently formal a category as that of articulation has its material aspect, that of intervention in the rudis indigestique mollis of what is sedimented in the artwork this side of its autonomy. Even aesthetic forms tend historically toward becoming material of a second order. The means, without which there would be no form, undermine form. This aporia is dodged, not solved, by works that renounce partial wholes of any significant dimension in order to protect their unity. This is the key objection to Weber's intensity without extension. Mediocre works, by contrast, leave the partial wholes unchallenged under the thin husk of their form, camouflaging them rather than melding them. It could almost be stated as a rule, one that testifies to the depth at which form and content are mediated and in each other, that the relation of the parts to the whole, an essential aspect of form, is constituted by way of detours. Artworks lose themselves in order to find themselves. The form category for this is the episode. In a collection of aphorisms from his expressionist phase published prior to World War I, Schoenberg noted that Ariadne provides no thread to follow through the interior of artworks. This, however, does not imply aesthetic irrationalism. Their form, their whole, and their logicality are hidden from artworks to the same degree as the elements, the content, desire the whole. Art that makes the highest claim compels itself beyond form as totality and into the fragmentary. The plight of form is most emphatically manifest in the difficulty of bringing temporal art forms to a conclusion. In music, composers often speak of the problem of a finale, and in literature, the problem of a denouement, which came to a head in Brecht. Once having shaken itself free of convention, no artwork was able to end convincingly, and the continued use of traditional endings only simulate the temporal convergence of the particular elements with the concluding instant as a totality of form. In many modern works that have attracted a large audience, the form was artfully held open because they wanted to demonstrate that the unity of form was no longer bestowed on them. Spurious infinity, the inability to close, becomes a freely chosen principle of method and expression. Like its play, which, rather than stopping, repeats itself word for word, is a reaction to this. Almost 50 years ago, Schoenberg proceeded in similar fashion in the March of his Serenade. After the reprise had been abolished, it was resurrected out of desperation. What Lukács once called the discharge of meaning was the force that allowed the artwork, once it has confirmed its imminent determination, to end on the model of one who dies old, having led a full life. That this is denied artworks, that they can no more die than can the hunter Gracchus, is internalized by them directly as an expression of horror. The unity of artworks cannot be what it must be. The unity of the multiplicitous, in that unity synthesizes. It damages what is synthesized and thus the synthesis. Artworks suffer from their mediated totality no less than from their immediateness. Against the Philistine division of art into form and content, it is necessary to insist on their unity. Against the sentimental view of their indifference in the artwork, it is necessary to insist that their difference endures even in their mediation. Not only is the perfect identity of the two chimerical, it would not redound to the success of the works. By analogy to Kant's maxim, that would become empty or blind, self-sufficient play or raw imperia. With regard to content, the concept of material best does justice to the mediated distinction. According to an almost universally accepted terminology in all the arts, material is what is formed. It is not the same as content, even if Hegel fatefully confounded the two. This can be explicated with regard to music. Its content is in any case what occurs, partial events, motifs, themes and their elaboration, changing situations. Content is not external to musical time, but essential to it, as time is essential to content. Content is everything that transpires in time. Material, by contrast, is what artists work with. It is the sum of all that is available to them, including words, colors, sounds, associations of every sort and every technique ever developed. To this extent, forms, too, can become material. It is everything that artists encounter about which they must make a decision. The idea, widespread among unreflective artists, of the open eligibility of any and all material is problematic in that it ignores that constraint inherent in technical procedures and the progress of material, which is imposed by various materials as well as by the necessity to employ specific materials. The choice of the material, its use, and the limitations of that use are an essential element of production. Even innovative expansion of the material into the unknown, going beyond the material's given condition, is to a large extent a function of the material and its critique, which is defined by the material itself. The concept of material is presupposed by alternatives such as whether a composer works with sounds that are native to tonality and recognizable as its derivatives, or whether he radically eliminates them. Analogous alternatives in painting are those between the representational and the non-representational, the perspectival and the non-perspectival. The concept of material may first have taken conscious shape in the 20s, if one leaves aside the lingo singers who tortured by a sense of the dubiousness of their musicality, exult over their material. Since Hegel's theory of the romantic artwork, the error has persisted that along with pre-established overarching forms, even the blindingness of the materials with which the forms were concerned has disintegrated. The expansion of available materials, which scorns the old boundaries between the arts, is primarily the result of the historical emancipation of the concept of form in art. This expansion has been much overestimated by those external to it. It is offset by the renunciations demanded of the artist not only by taste but by the condition of the material. Of all the material that is abstractly employable, only the tiniest part does not collide with the condition of spirit and is as such concretely usable. Thus, material is not natural material even if it appears so to artists. Rather, it is thoroughly historical. Its supposedly sovereign position is the result of the collapse of every ontology of art, which has in turn affected the materials. They are no less dependent on the transformation of technique than is technique on the materials that it manipulates. It is obvious how much a composer who, for instance, works with tonal material receives this material from tradition. If, however, he turns critically against tradition through the use of an autonomous material, one completely purged of concepts such as consonance, dissonance, triad, and diatonicism, the negated is nevertheless retained in the negation. Such works speak by virtue of the taboos they radiate, the falseness, or at the least, the shock of every triad that they permit makes this obvious enough, and this is the objective cause of the comfortably prescribed monotonousness of radically modern art. The rigorousness of the most recent developments in music and painting, which right into the smallest detail of the emancipated material ruthlessly eliminates all traces of the traditional and the negated, obeys all the more recklessly, under the illusion of the pure givenness of a material without any intrinsic quality, the historical tendency, stripping the material of any qualitative dimension which superficially connotes its dehistoricization, is itself the material's historical propensity, the propensity of subjective reason. What defines its limits are that it leaves the historical determinations behind in the material. What aesthetic terminology once called subjective subject matter, and Hegel the subject, is not to be apodictically excluded from the concept of material. All the same, while the concept of subject matter remains a concern of art, in its immediacy as a theme that can be lifted over from external reality and worked upon, it has, since Kandinsky, Proust, and Joyce, incontrovertibly declined. Parallel to the critique of the heterogeneously imposed, the aesthetically unassimilable, discontent has been growing with the so-called great themes to which Hegel, as well as Kierkegaard, and more recently many Marxist theoreticians and playwrights attributed such eminence. The idea that works that occupy themselves with august events, whose sublimity is usually only the fruit of ideology and of respect for power and magnitude, are thereby augmented in their dignity, was unmasked once Van Gogh painted a stool or a few sunflowers in such a fashion that the images rage with the storm of all those emotions in the experience of which the individual Van Gogh's epoch for the first time registered the historical catastrophe. This having become evident, it could be shown in earlier art, too, how little its authenticity depends on the trumped-up or even actual relevance of its objects. What is the importance of Delft in Vermeer? Does it not hold that, as Krauss wrote, a gutter well painted is of greater value than a badly painted palace? Out of a loose sequence of events, a world of perspectives, moods, and shocks takes shape for the more pellucid eye, and trashy poetry becomes the poetry of trash, damnable only to that official idiocy that holds a badly painted palace preferable to the well-painted gutter. Hegel's aesthetics of content and aesthetics of subject matter, in keeping with the spirit of many of his intentions, subscribes undialectically to the objectivation of art by way of a raw relation to subjects. Essentially, he excluded mimesis from his aesthetics. In German idealism, the turn to the object was always coupled with Philistinism, as is most crassly obvious in the comments on historical painting in the third book of The World as Will and Representation. In its relation to art, idealism's eternity is unmasked as kitsch, to which he who clings to idealism's inalienable categories is consigned. Brecht ignored this. In his essay Fünf Schwierigkeiten beim Schreiben der Wahrheit, 5 difficulties in writing the truth, he concludes, quote, "Thus, it is, for example, not untrue to say that chairs provide a place to sit and that rain falls from above. Many poets write truths of this kind. They are like painters who cover the walls of sinking ships with still lifes. For them, even what we have called our first difficulty in writing the truth does not exist, and yet they have a clear conscience. They produce their daubs undisturbed by the mighty or by the screams of the ravaged. The absurdity of what they do produces in them a deep pessimism that they sell at a good price, and that would actually better suit those who watch these masters and their sales. At the same time, it is anything but easy to recognize that their truths are truths about chairs or the rain, since they usually sound completely different, as if they were truths about important things. For the process of artistic production is precisely that of according importance to something. Only by taking a close look does one perceive that they are only saying a chair is a chair and nobody can change the fact that rain falls from above." End quote. This is a blague. It just provokes the official cultural mentality, which has even succeeded in integrating Van Gogh's chair as a piece of furniture. Yet if one wanted to extract a norm out of this, it would be merely regressive. There is no point to making threats. A painted chair can actually be extremely significant, to the extent that one does not prefer to avoid this bloated word. Incomparably deeper and socially relevant experiences can be sedimented in the how of a painting than in faithful portraits of generals or revolutionary heroes. All paintings of this sort retrospectively take their place in the Galerie des Places de Versailles of 1871, regardless whether the generals, eternalized in historical postures, were to have led red armies that occupy countries in which the revolution never took place. This problematic of thematic material whose relevance is directly borrowed from reality also befalls the intentions that are injected into the work. However spiritual these ideas may be in themselves, once introduced into the artwork, they become no less subject matter than if they were Meyer, the Basel Mayer who promises to fetch the coal. As Hegel well knew, what artists can say, they say only through the form, not by letting that form deliver a message. Among the sources of error in the contemporary interpretation and critique of artworks, the most disastrous is the confusion of the intention, what the artist supposedly wants to say, with the content of the work. In reaction, the content of the artwork is increasingly lodged in what has not been affected by the artist's subjective intentions, whereas content is blocked in works in which intention, whether as fabula docet or as philosophical thesis, demands primacy. The objection that an artwork is too reflected is not only ideology, but has its element of truth in the work's being too little reflected, not reflected against the incursion of its own intention. The philological procedure, which imagines that it grasps securely the content of the work when it grasps its intention, passes judgment imminently on itself in that it tautologically extracts from artworks what was put into them earlier. The secondary literature on Thomas Mann is the most repellent example of this. Granted, this practice is fostered by a genuine tendency that has its source in literature. Naive immediacy and its illusoriness has become threadbare for literature, which no longer disavows reflection and is thus compelled to strengthen the dimension of intention. This supplies an interpretive method alien to spirit with an easy surrogate for spirit. It is incumbent on artworks, just as occurred in modernism's greatest achievements, to incorporate the reflexive element by its further reflexivity into the work itself rather than tolerating it in the form of residual subject matter. However little the intention of artworks is their content, if only because no intention, however neatly presented, is assured of being realized by the work, still only a stubborn rigorism would disqualify intention as an element of the work. Intentions have their locus in the dialectic between the mimetic pole of artworks and their methexis in enlightenment. Intentions have their locus not only in being the subjectively moving and organizing force that is thereupon extinguished in the work, but also in the objectivity of the work itself. Because the artworks is not simply inert, intentions are endowed with an independence as specific as that of any other element of the artwork. One would need to ignore the complexion of important artworks for the sake of a thema probandum to deny that, however variable historically, their importance stands in relation to intention. If material in the artwork is truly resistant to the artwork's otherwise pure identity, the inner process of identity in artworks is essentially that between the material and intention. Without intention, without the immanent form of the principle of identity, form would not exist any more than it would without the mimetic impulse. The surplus of intentions reveals that the objectivity of artworks cannot be reduced simply to mimesis. The objective bearer of intentions, which synthesizes the individual intentions of artworks into a whole, is their meaning. It remains relevant in spite of everything problematic inherent to it and in spite of all the evidence that this is not all there is to artworks. The meaning of Goethe's Iphigenie is humanity. If this idea were merely intended abstractly by the poetic subject, if it were in Hegel's words simply a maxim, as indeed it is in Schiller, it would be irrelevant to the work. In that, however, by means of language, humanity itself becomes mimetic, is itself expressed in the non-conceptual without sacrificing its conceptual element. Meaning achieves a fruitful tension to the work's content, to what has been composed. The meaning of a poem such as Verlaine's Clair de Lune cannot be univocally established, yet this is not to say that its meaning does not reach beyond the incomparable resonance of the verses. The poem's sensuality is itself an element of intention. Happiness and sadness, which accompany sexuality as soon as it descends into itself and negates spirit as ascetic, are the poem's content. The flawlessly presented idea of sensuality divorced from sensuousness in the meaning. This trait, central to the whole of late 19th and early 20th century French art, including Debussy, contains the potential of radical modernism, and there is no lack of actual historical ties. Conversely, it is the starting point, though not the telos of criticism, whether the intention is objectivated in what is composed. The false lines between intention and results, rarely missing from recent art, are no less ciphers of the work's content than is the result. A higher level of critique, however, that of the truth or untruth of the content, often becomes immanent critique through the knowledge of the relation between intention and what has been written, painted, or composed. Intention does not always miscarry as a result of the inadequate form-giving powers of the subject. The untruth of intention interrupts the objective truth content. If what is supposed to be truth content is in itself untrue, that prohibits inner consistency. Such untruth tends to be mediated by the untruth of the intention, as is apparent at the highest level of form in Wagner's music. For traditional aesthetics, and to a large extent for traditional art as well, the determination of the totality of the artwork is its determination as a nexus of meaning. The reciprocal relation of whole and parts is supposed to shape the work as something meaningful to such an extent that the quintessence of this meaning coincides with the metaphysical content. Because the nexus of meaning is constituted by the relation of elements, and not in atomistic fashion in something given that is sensual, what can justly be called the spirit of artworks should be comprehensible in that nexus. That the spirit of an artwork is the configuration of its elements is more than a seductive idea. It attains its truth in the face of all crude reification or materialization of the spirit and content of artworks. Directly or indirectly, everything that appears in the work contributes to such meaning, though not all that appears is necessarily of equal importance. The establishment of relative importance was one of the most effective means for aesthetic articulation, as is obvious enough in the differentiation between thetic main events and transitions, and between the essential and accidental yet requisite elements. These differentiations in traditional art were largely determined schematically. With a critique of schematic organization, the differentiations become dubious. Art tends toward processes in which everything that occurs is equidistant to the midpoint, where everything accidental arouses the suspicion of being superfluously ornamental. This is one of the most imposing difficulties in the articulation of recent art. Art's inexorable self-criticism, the requirements of jostless composition, underscores this difficulty and promotes chaos, the ever-lurking precondition of all art. Even in works with the highest level of form, the crisis of differentiation has frequently resulted in a dimension of non-differentiation. Efforts to defend against this have almost without exception, though often latently, had recourse to borrowings from the aesthetic resources that they oppose. Even here, the total domination of the material and movements toward diffuseness converge. I'm going to cut it short, a few pages early. Still read for freaking 15 minutes. See you in the morning.